Right now, you're listening to the Azeem Digital Asks all-round digital marketing podcast, the podcast that covers traditional and non-traditional marketing topics with brilliant guests and brilliant insights. Stay tuned for another great episode. Hello and welcome back to the Azeem Digital Asks podcast. This is the all-round digital marketing podcast. What I was going to say there is this is a topic that I'm really looking forward to learning more about. My guest is laughing already. We're talking all about LGBTQ plus inclusion in the marketing sector. I've got a wonderful guest called Andy, who I'll let him introduce himself in a moment. I want to start by saying that I'm really, really excited to talk about a topic like this, because it's something that I shamefully do not know enough about. So I am very glad that he has agreed to join me. My friend, welcome to the show.
Thanks, mate. Happy to be here.
You are an absolute legend. For those who don't know who you are, would you mind giving a short intro to yourself, who you are, what you do, and why you are such a brilliant human being?
My name's Andy. My pronouns are they and he, and I work in digital marketing for a fantastic agency called Noisy Little Monkey. The easiest way to introduce myself is through a slew of labels, so I'm gonna start with that one. I'm a Christian. I'm autistic. I'm dyslexic. I'm non-binary. I'm queer, but I'm also obsessed with the color yellow. It's becoming an increasing problem. I'm an illustrator. And I really love marketing, like an embarrassing amount. I talk about it at dinner parties. It's not good.
That is what it's all about. And I was very fortunate to have the chance, thanks to our friends at Noisy Little Monkey, to meet you at the most recent version of Brighton SEO, and we got to hang out for a little bit. And for those who don't know Andy, absolute legend, and I'm going to say that lots of times during this episode. But yeah, look, let's get right into it. Before we start, though, what I'm going to say is what I said to you when I met you in person. And like I said at the start of this episode, this is something that I am learning about. So for yourself and for the listeners, if I make a mistake, apologies in advance, because please know this is coming from a place of learning, and I'm going to make mistakes along the way. So I'm going to hold my hands up in advance and just say, I'm trying to learn more, which is why I've engaged with you. Please don't
Can
hate
I
me.
add my own caveat to that?
Go on.
Which is, I think people can always tell the difference between someone who's trying and someone who isn't. So for me, I'd much rather that you're engaging in it, trying and getting it wrong, but learning from your mistakes, than you're like, oh, that's too terrifying. I'm not even going to bother.
Okay,
So
good.
we've all got to learn.
Deal made. Right, let's jump into this. So we're talking all about LGBTQ plus inclusion in the marketing sector. And I think the best place to start, Andy, is essentially it's a two-pronged question. So either how do you define, or what does it mean to you to be a marketer who is part of the LGBTQ plus community?
So I love this question because it's not really a thing. So, in the sense of there's not a defined community of often I use queer and LGBTQ plus interchangeably. Some people who are LGBTQ plus may not define themselves as queer, but just to let you know, I'm going to be doing that. Um, but yeah, there's you've got women in SEO, or you've got the Be Digital platform for Black marketers that's emerging at the moment. There are loads of kind of communities within marketing for marginalized groups, but we don't really have that for the LGBTQ plus community. But I think for me personally, it's about kind of the way that we do everything in marketing. So, marketing is power. That's a bold statement, but I'm going to stick with it. In the sense of we have the power to kind of change our society, to influence our society if we're doing our job right. And so, for me, as a queer person in the marketing industry, I think, there's so much potential for change there, and there's so much potential to kind of show people how glorious and how amazing kind of a queer inclusive LGBTQ plus inclusive society can be. We can change that narrative if we know what we're doing.
Love that. Love that. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to touch on part of that. So I think part of what you just said involves pronouns as part of identity. And recently, I've noticed that more and more people have started to include their pronouns in their social bios, for example. Or, for example, at conferences, you can now have them on your badges. Lanyards is the word I'm looking for. So, for me, I guess I'd love to learn from you directly. Why do you think that pronouns or identity is important to address for us as marketers?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think pronouns has become such like a overwhelming social issue that if you looked at the media, you'd think that the number one issue for trans people is pronouns. The number one issue for trans people is like legal recognition and rights. But like people getting your pronouns right massively affects your daily life. And it's a really easy thing to get right, and it's a really easy thing to get wrong. Um, so I think pronouns are really important because uh, it kind of demonstrates other issues, and it demonstrates like somebody being a safe person or not. Um, and then like identity broadly in marketing is so important. Like that's all we ever talk about, right? We're always talking about like focus on your customers, think about your personas. Like it's really important to kind of dig into identity. That's one of the reasons I love marketing. But in doing that, often we can kind of maintain these like stereotypes or these kind of binary narratives, um, which are, I was going to say dangerous. That's maybe a stretch, but they can be because they kind of uphold other issues. So if things like, if you're an SEO who's worth their salt, then stuff you write is going to be at the top of Google. And if you're doing even small things like using they instead of he or she, that's non-binary inclusive, or when you write alt descriptions, if you don't know the gender of the person you're writing about, not if they look male or female, but if you don't know, like you haven't been told by them what their gender is, then you don't know. So you can say, oh, this is a masculine person with short hair doing this, or you can say, this is a person with long hair doing this, right? And even things like that, you're helping yourself get a better idea, and you're also kind of changing the way that people see uh, sources of authority talking about people and talking about these issues.
Brilliant. You've very nicely led me to my next question about sources of authority, and you just touched on what brands can be doing there. Do you have any examples that you can share with the listeners of brands or companies who are tackling this issue really well?
Yeah, so I think like gay people love Starbucks. I don't know if you ever noticed that. It's like a meme. Gay people love
No.
Starbucks, right? And in 2019 they did this and this is advertising, but it proves my point. They did this ad of a trans kid, and it was kind of the person wasn't getting their uh, they weren't hearing their name, and then they go to Starbucks and they hear their name for the first time, right? And like that's a real experience that happened to me. That was the first time I heard someone use my chosen name, and it's a true experience for a lot of trans people. So they did their research, they worked with trans people, and they got it right. And I think people really appreciated that. So the big any good examples like that, like Happy Socks recently did a partnership with the Fluid Project, which is like this is like a BTC example, but yeah, they are a queer run organization, and then they also donated to charity. So there was a lot of like uh actual interaction with LGBTQ plus people. As long as you're asking actual people of the community to do it, then you can't go too far wrong, but also pay them. That helps. Um, and I think also like make sure that you're diversifying who you ask. Like there's a big problem within the queer community of like what's colloquially called the gatriarchy. But it's like white cis, which means not trans, gay men, who kind of are only one step removed from the, like, I don't know, ideal of like a white cis straight man, right? And so often they kind of dominate queer spaces, and they can be transphobic or, racist, and that's not like a real kind of representation of queerness. So I think if you're going to be asking influencers or like charities, um, like who are queer, for advice and to work with them on projects, it's really important to make sure that you're not just asking white gay men. You can't be queer inclusive if you're not kind of anti-racist, and you're not inclusive of disabled people as well. Like, that just doesn't work.
Thanks very much for that. So look, we're about 10 minutes in, 11 minutes in, and my head is full already. I'm learning a lot. So honestly, thank you so much. This is brilliant. I wanted to move on and say, look, let's imagine that a brand or an agency is listening to this, completely new about this area or aspect of inclusion, and they're thinking, right, okay, I need to take action on what Andy's sharing with us. What resources would you recommend to them where they can sort of start and get involved and take action?
So Google's a good one, but it's good to be careful what you're googling. So the Stonewall glossary is really good. It's like a list of kind of queer related terms. So if you've got no idea what's going on, go and read that, because then at least you'll kind of be able to understand some of what people are saying. The Things Not to Say series on YouTube is really good, because it's actual people from various communities like talking about how to interact with them, and that's really helpful. um Bit of a basic answer, but like content creators on Instagram, and books are really good for like actually kind of getting a personal understanding of people. So Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Menon's really good, as is In Their Shoes by Jamie Windust, and Dr. Devon Price on Instagram. They've got like a PhD, and they have such a nuanced kind of uh, understanding of it. So I really enjoy their content. But I think it's also important to say that, like, we're still working this out. Like, everyone is still working this out. So as long as you kind of don't work with anyone who is explicitly anti-queer, explicitly anti-LGBT, like, that's something that Noisy Little Monkey, we will only work with clients who we kind of agree with morally, um, and learn from the people who are willing to talk about it. So I'm one of them. Like, I'm a queer person, but I'm also somebody who's studied sociology and who's really interested in these topics, and I'm willing to kind of talk about it. Don't go up to whatever employee you have in your workplace and be like, "Hey, so gay rights." But, there are lots of people who are doing the work. Um, so I think it's just about kind of, yeah, going to the source, and finding what they say, which I think is true for all marginalized communities, really.
Absolutely, and I have to sidestep for a second and say you are doing my job better than me, because the way that you're linking these together is fantastic. So you mentioned about colleagues there, and that's my next question for you. So what should non-LGBTQ plus marketers do to make their workplaces more inclusive?
Great question. Uh, this is a shameless plug, but I went on another podcast, obviously not as good as this one, called Nobody Panic, and I did a episode on how to be a good trans ally. So if you search how to be a good trans ally on Spotify, Nobody Panic, it should come up. So, like, listen to that, because I go into like big detail on that. In terms of like workplaces, at Digital Gaggle, which is the event that Noisy Little Monkey held earlier, we came up with this thing that was like, cry, build a gang, leave. So if you're like a queer person who's uh, like struggling, then that's the kind of 3-step plan. But I think, like, if you're not a queer person, then as you said at the start, like putting pronouns in your bio, putting pronouns in your email. So we've got all of ours in our signature, and that's really good. Challenging things that people say on calls. Um, like if somebody presumes, if you don't know the gender of somebody, use they pronouns until you find it out, because like that normalizes it. And also I think like it's so much easier to do the work when it's not about you. So go to your HR if you're lucky enough to have one. Go to your line manager, your CEO, and say, "Hey, what are our queer like LGBTQ plus policies at work? Like, can I just make sure that we're doing everything we can to make this a safe space? Like, do we think about this in our hiring? Like, and actually putting that work in when you're before you need to. Does that make sense? So before
Yeah,
somebody comes out in the office, make it easy for them to do so, because it's really hard.
that is brilliant. Honestly, brilliant.
You're so nice to me.
Wait till I press stop recording. You mentioned in your previous answer there, Andy, about queer marketers who might be struggling, and I'd love to just pick on that a little bit more. So, if there are people listening to this in the marketing industry who are queer and are struggling, and who feel like their workplace is not inclusive at all, what advice would you give to them? Maybe if they don't know where to start, for example, what advice would you give to those people?
Well, first of all, add me on Twitter, because we need a community happening here. Um, I think yeah, the first thing would be if you have a HR, talk to them. I know a lot of like small agencies or in-house like smaller companies maybe don't. But also sometimes HR can be not great. So I think the first thing would be to identify your biggest ally. So that's the person who you think is going to be like most receptive, and kind of sit them down in a private, like chill environment and just be like, hey, I'm finding some of these things a little bit difficult. Like, do you think you could help me work them out or help me have those conversations? Just so you know you've got someone on your team. Um, and then be clear and focus on small wins. So, like, identify the things that are really getting to you and try and fix those first. Like, you are not responsible for making the whole company better. Um, but if it's affecting your experience of the workplace, like, you should do something about that. It was something my colleague Josh said to me, because I feel I'm very British. I feel really bad correcting people, or I used to feel really bad correcting people on my pronouns. And Josh said, "Well, if I got your name wrong, you'd immediately tell me, wouldn't you? Because like that's awkward and it's wrong. So why are pronouns any different?" And I've found it much easier in these kind of situations, to employ the model that Cal on Sex Education, which is a TV show on Netflix. It's great. Uh, they get misgendered and they say, "Oh, I use they them pronouns, but no worries." And it's kind of firm, but calm, and it just de-escalates the situation. So when I'm talking to other people in the marketing industry and they're like, I'm like, "Oh, this is it. Don't worry about it. Like, I'm going to correct you, and then we're all going to move on, because this is not the most important thing we've got to talk about now."
Love that, and definitely minus the sex education on Netflix. Nobody needs to know about that. All the things that you've mentioned, all the resources that you've mentioned throughout this podcast, definitely share links with me and I'll add them in to
Yeah,
the
we'll
show
do.
notes. Sadly, we do have to part ways soon, Andy, but one of the things that I'm
Heartbreak.
keen, I know, yeah, one of the things that I'm keen to do is obviously just give you an open section for you to talk about anything that you want here that we haven't covered that you think might benefit the listeners. So essentially, the floor, digital audio space, whatever you want to call it, all yours, mate.
I think I'm going to take this precious moment to say, please stop turning your logos into rainbows simply for the month of June. It's my biggest pet hate. There's so many memes on the internet about all the rainbow flags being pulled down in July the 1st, right? So yeah, I think the biggest thing is uh, it's not that hard to avoid tokenism, but you do have to put in the work. And like, I really appreciate you being like, I might get this wrong, but you're only gonna start getting it right with practice and with reading. And like, we're all learning. We're all trying to get better at so many different things, and this is just one of them. Yeah, I think that's everything. Your questions were great.
The listeners can't see, but I've got what I thought was the praying emoji. Virtual high fives for you there.
Loved it.
Before you go, Andy, I would love for people to be able to find out more about you, follow you. So essentially, this is the part of the episode right before the end where you share all your details and hopefully social media following goes through the roof.
Can't wait. I mean, you are famous, so I'm really excited to just riff off that. No, so on LinkedIn, I'm Andy Thornton, Andy, and I've got a blog on LinkedIn of like 10 ways to make your workplace more inclusive. And that's not just for LGBTQ plus people, that's kind of for all different groups. I'm on Twitter and Instagram as Human Satsuma. My Twitter is like professional marketing based, and my Instagram is not professional, but follow it anyway. I do put quite a lot of like queer resources on there. So if you're interested in that, then feel free to follow it. And I tweet about kind of inclusion quite a lot. I've only just got Twitter, so any support is really welcome. I'm also always happy to field questions. Like, lots of queer people aren't, and it's not their job, but I am, and I'm explicitly saying that I am. So please use me as a resource. Although I would say, if Google can answer the question, don't ask me. So don't message me saying, "What does non-binary mean?" Because you can Google it. And then the final thing is, I work for Noisy Little Monkey, and we do quite a lot of marketing blogs. I write quite a lot of them. So check those out as well.
Awesome. Like I said, definitely share those links with me, please. I guess all that's left for me to say is massive thank you. This has been really, really insightful, and it's definitely one that I'll be coming back to. Believe me, if these listeners' number rise, it'll probably be me coming back to it over and over again. But I really appreciate you taking the time out to share this with me and with the listeners. So thank you so much. If you enjoyed this episode, please, first of all, before even subscribing, liking, all that usual nonsense that I talk about, go and follow Andy. Thank him for sharing his knowledge and wisdom. And then when you've done, come back, run this episode up 10 more times, and then like it, share it, subscribe it. Knock onto your next door neighbour and tell them that you've just learnt a lot about this stuff and that you want to share it with them. If they don't work in marketing, it would be a little bit weird, but still, pass the message on. Andy, thank you so much and
Thank
take
you
care.
so much, mate. I'm so happy to be here. Cheers.
So that was another great episode in the bag. I'm really enjoying hearing from some brilliant people in this industry. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow me on Spotify. Please leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you are using. Tell a friend to tell a friend, and hopefully see you for the next episode.